What's up everybody, I'm Jason and welcome back to some more tips and tricks for the EOS R5. Since the focus of the last few videos has been broadly on manual focusing, this time around I wanted to focus a little bit more on some autofocus settings and what you can use to customize the way you interact with the camera in terms of controlling the autofocus system. So as with most of these videos, much if not all of what I'm going to cover also applies to EOS R5's sibling cameras, especially the EOS R6 and R3. However, I own and use an R5, so that's where this video focuses and what I've used for all of the testing. As such, if you use one of those other cameras, you may find there are some differences between your camera and mine. Now, I'm going to start off this video talking about the Limit AF Methods setting, which is found on the AF4 menu. And this setting is all about making your life a little bit easier or faster by disabling the things you don't actually use. So Canon's mirrorless cameras currently have 8 different AF methods, or AF areas as Canon now calls them on the EOS R3. These are spot, single point, 2 expanded single point points, 3 zone areas, and the full sensor face plus tracking method. Now, if you don't use all of those settings, you can use this setting to limit which ones can be selected to make stepping through them slightly faster. Now, of course, the utility of this ranges from barely noticeable to a small but nice time saver depending on how exactly you switch AF methods on your camera. Now, the biggest time savings for this come when you use a button to step through the AF methods. So, for example, by default, you press the multifunction button to change the AF method while you're in the AF method or AF point selection screen. Each press of the multifunction button causes the AF method to advance one entry to the right in the list. So if you wanted to select one method to the left, you would have to push the multifunction button 7 times to get there. However, if you disable AF methods you don't actually use, you can cut down on the number of button presses that you have to do to get to the ones you do. Now, disabled AF methods do still show up in the list of methods, whether you're looking in the menu, the quick control menu, the autofocus point selection screen, or the dial function menu if you have AF points or AF method selection set in a dial function menu or to be enabled in the dial function menu, but they will be grayed out and unselectable. Now, personally, I tend to have several AF methods disabled most of the time. Generally, I disable one or all of the expanded single point methods and the zone AF methods, which leaves my camera generally with just 3 selections that I can have: spot, single point, and the face plus tracking setting to switch between. Now, that said, I am not dogmatic about this setting, and in fact, I will reconfigure this regularly to turn on AF methods I think I might need or even think might be useful for any upcoming shoot or scenario. Now, another way you can speed up the autofocus method selection is to change which control you use to select AF methods in the autofocus point selection menu itself. And this is done by changing the autofocus method selection control entry on the Autofocus 4 menu page. Now, here you will find 2 options. One is to use the multifunction button, and the other is to use the main command dial. Now, changing this to use the dial makes selecting the AF method faster, since you can scroll the dial a little bit faster, easier than the button, and you can select left and right in the list. However, in the AF point selection menu, the main and quick control dials normally are used or normally move the autofocus point horizontally and vertically respectively. So if you do change this to use the main dial, then there will be no dial available to move the point horizontally in the AF point selection screen, and you will have to use the multi-controller. Now, for the vast majority of my time using not only the EOS R5, but its DSLR predecessors such as the 5D Mark IV, I've always changed this to use the main dial instead of the multifunction button. Basically, on my cameras, I have them set up so that I have the multi-controller set to direct AF point selection, so it is active all the time for moving the AF point. So the only time I use the AF point selection menu is to change the AF method, and therefore having it be quick is ideal. Now, next I want to look at orientation-linked AF points, and this is found on the AF4 menu. And this function can be useful in situations where you're frequently changing the camera's orientation, and want to keep the AF or have to keep moving the AF point. So in those situations, the camera can be set up to store different autofocus points for the 3 different camera orientations. Now those are when the camera is held landscape, when the camera is held portrait with the vertical or with the hand grip at the top, and when the camera is held portrait when the grip at the bottom. Now, on the EOS R5 and R6, you will find 2 options in this setting. These are same for both vertical and horizontal, and separate AF points, point only. EOS R3 users will find an additional option, separate autofocus points, area plus point. So same for both vertical horizontal, which is the default setting, keeps the autofocus point in the same place in the frame regardless of how the camera is rotated. Separate autofocus points, point only, saves a separate autofocus point position for each of those 3 orientations that I just talked about. However, when this is set, the autofocus method will remain the same for all orientations. So in other words, if you have the camera set to use single point AF, you will have a single AF point in all orientations, even if the points are in different places on the frame. Now the third option, which as I said is only available on the EOS R3 currently, extends the separate autofocus points point only mode to also store the autofocus area. So for example, on an R3, you could use Flex Zone AF2, which gives you a large vertical zone for your landscape orientation. Then you could use Flex Zone AF3, which gives you a large horizontal zone for your vertical orientation. That way, in both vertical and horizontal orientations of your camera, you would have essentially a large vertical zone in the frame. Now, whether this is going to be useful to you or not is going to be situationally dependent. So personally on my R5, I tend to leave this set for separate points, as I don't find that becomes a huge impediment if I'm only occasionally rotating the camera. In fact, I hardly notice it. And for situations where I'm constantly rotating the camera, it tends to make things a little faster. Next on this tour of autofocus functions is the multi-controller sensitivity for AF point select function, found 4th down on the AF5 menu page. This function controls the speed of the AF point when you use the multi-controller to move it. And there's 3 options here, which is minus, 0, and plus. So put simply, the higher the sensitivity setting here, the faster the AF point moves around when you hold the multi-controller in a given direction. Now, I've found the default of 0 to be a good solution for me. It allows me to move the AF point around the frame fast enough that I don't feel that I'm being bogged down by it, but I also don't have to spend a lot of time trying to bump the point into a position when I want it to be somewhere very specific. Now, I have looked at, and this was based on a commenter's recommendation in a previous video, I have tried setting my camera to the plus setting, and quite honestly, I can't get used to it. It's just too fast for me to position accurately without having to resort to a lot of constant tapping to get the point into position, and overall that's just slower for me. However, for that person who recommended it, it was great, and for you, it might be great as well. Now that said, if you find moving the AF point around sluggish or a bit too fast for your liking, this is the setting that you want to start playing with. Now finally, I'm going to wrap this up with the continuous autofocus setting. Now on the R5 and R6, this is found on the Autofocus 1 menu page. However, for some reason on the EOS R3, Canon decided to rename this to Preview AF and move it to the AF3 menu page. That said, at least as far as I can tell, it's still doing exactly the same thing on the R3 as it does on the R5 and 6. Now, all of that said, renaming the function I don't think helped make the function any more clear or what it does any more clearer to the user, so I'm not entirely sure why Canon chose to do that. Anyway, put simply, continuous AF keeps the autofocus system running all the time while the camera is on and in the shooting standby mode. Consequently, the camera will always track and focus on detected subjects or whatever is under the autofocus point when you're in a single point mode. Now, ultimately, I have 2 thoughts on this setting. So on one hand, this feels very much like it's a relic from the slow, contrast-based autofocus systems that Canon had in their old compact cameras and early DSLRs. After all, Having an autofocus system always active makes a lot of sense in a camera that can't focus nearly instantaneously to basically minimize the time you have to wait when you want to take a picture. However, with dual pixel AF having virtually identical performance to a traditional DSLR's phase detection sensor, at least in terms of speed, driving the focus motor all the time just feels like a waste of battery power, and constantly having the focus shift when you're looking through the viewfinder can be a little disconcerting. So on the other hand, this may also persist as an accessibility feature, and that is, I can imagine it might be useful to some people with a physical disability or impairment that would prevent them from, or that would allow them to use the camera more effectively. So for those that don't have the coordination or motor control to either half press the shutter button or hold a separate AF button on, button down, this would allow them to continuously, or have the camera focus for them and then just essentially mash the shutter button to take a picture. Now, in that case, basically, what Canon did with the R3's new title makes it even less clear or useful to those people if they're looking to find it. So again, I don't really understand why Canon decided to change the name. So that said, if you've never tried it, continuous autofocus on the R5 at least runs at the full focusing speed that the camera and lens can support. It's not a smooth, slow focusing system like you get in movie mode when movie servo AF is activated. Moreover, continuous autofocus respects the lens drive when AF impossible setting, and that is if you have that set to prevent the lens from driving when autofocus is impossible, and the camera can't determine where to focus because of whatever reasons causing it to not be able to determine where to focus, continuous AF won't cause the camera to focus hunt either. Finally, continuous AF and full-time manual focusing interact with each other similar to if you always held down the shutter release or half press of the shutter release or the AF on button. So if you saw my video on manual focus settings, I talked about how we now have different full-time manual focus capabilities depending on the lens that's mounted on the camera and whether the camera is set up for front or rear button focusing. When continuous autofocus is enabled, the enhanced full-time manual capable lenses, for example, such as the RF 100 to 500, will still allow you to manually focus the lens basically all of the time. However, for most RF lenses, even when the camera is set to back button focusing, the focus ring will be disabled while the lens is set to autofocus mode and this setting is enabled. So in any event, the most obvious downside to enabling this is the reduced battery life that you'll see. As I said, it can also make the viewfinder a little disconcerting if it's jumping focus around not necessarily at your control or under your control. Now personally, I don't see a compelling reason to enable continuous autofocus unless of course you have a disability where it does help you work around that and get the pictures you want to get. Now that said, if you do use this feature, I'd love to know why in the comments for how well it works for you. So I'm going to wrap this tour of autofocus settings up here. If you found this useful, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you aren't already. And finally, if you know someone else that might find this useful, help them and me by sharing it with them. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.